I did not excel at all until my year abroad. Um, I I was a mediocre student. I was lazy. I did not enjoy to learn. And then I went abroad for a year, and that changed my whole mindset. And I came back and continued my education. And I was, for me, at that point, it wasn't about grades anymore. It was about learning. I wanted to learn.
Welcome to the Founder's Journey podcast, where we unravel the life stories of unique and successful entrepreneurs. We will take a deep dive into their highs and lows and over-the-top accomplishments. So get ready for the Founder's Journey podcast with your host, Jimmy Dulambakis. Welcome to this episode of Founder's Journey podcast with Henning Schwinum. In this episode of Founder's Journey, we hear from Henning as he reflects on wide-ranging and personal journey that has taken him from Germany to the US, through corporate life, into startup growth, and eventually to finding his own company. He is co-founder of Vendux, a marketplace for fractional executives. I hope you enjoy this podcast and thank you for joining us. Welcome. Thank you for joining the Founder's Journey podcast. Jimmy Dulambakis, we're so excited to have you today. Thank you so much for being here. And we just love to hear your story of who you are and how you became the person you became.
Great. Well, pleasure to be here. And I love nothing more than talking about myself.
Very good. Okay, so we're going to get along just well here. So tell me, where did you grow up? What was your childhood like? Can you give us a little background on that?
I grew up in Germany, so born and raised there. First time I came to the US is probably the most exciting part of my childhood. I was 16 and came on a student exchange. And to this day, I don't know why I did it. I'd heard about the idea of leaving home for a year, living with a host family, and going to school someplace else. And I thought that was phenomenal, and signed up for it. And my parents, to my surprise, went along. And that's how I ended up south of Greensboro, North Carolina, back in 1982. Went to high school, lived with a host family for a year. And that ultimately is also the reason why I ended up here in the US, and didn't stay the rest of the rest of my life in Germany or in Europe.
And where did you grow up in Germany?
Cologne on the Rhine River.
And is that like a city? I'm not familiar with Germany, but is it like a mid-sized city, a big city?
For American standards, it's a mid-sized city, about 1 million people. It's the fifth or sixth largest city in Germany. So it's a pretty major town, especially in the part of the country where it's located.
And what was like childhood in Germany? I'm sure it's the same as here, but what would you compare it to?
I am, I cannot tell sobbing stories about growing up in poverty, or nor can I tell that I grew up with riches. My father was a chemist. My mother was a elementary school teacher, and I have two sisters. And I would say that we lived a pretty sheltered and pretty calm life. I did sports. I got into music, at age 13, 14 when I became a teenager, but I didn't play an instrument. I started collecting records, and I still own all the records that I bought from every last cent or pfennig that I had left as pocket money, which I invested all in records. And they still are good to play, and we host vinyl parties at our house.
That is so cool. That is so cool. And you go back and you just pull the records out and you play them. That's really cool.
Yeah, I brought them all over when I moved here and they still sound like the originals, or like they sounded to me back when I was sitting there in awe. You 20 minutes each side, uh, uh, a headset so I wouldn't disturb my parents, and then you were holding on to the album cover and you read it front, back, center when it was a fold out, and digested every word that was printed on the album cover while listening to about 40 minutes of great music.
Wow. And what you're saying is the albums had various songs, whereas now kids just listen to singles more so, right? Where the album was a masterpiece. It wasn't just that one big hit song you heard on the radio. It was everything, the story behind it, the feel of the album, right?
That's absolutely right. I mean, you listen to one side beginning to end. You didn't just jump in the middle. You didn't pull the needle off after one song. And it also had meaningful breaks between the songs. I learned that when I DJ'd in a vinyl club here where we live. And it was my first time ever DJing, and then the owner came to me after a few songs, and he said, you need to make the breaks shorter between the songs. They need to blend into each other. And I to me that was very foreign. Breaks between songs are deliberate because the next song has a different vibe, has a different speed, has a different messaging. It's meant to sound different, so I had to learn.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're all about blending here, you know. We don't want any quietness because then we have to think, and we don't like to think too much, you know. We don't like the quiet space.
Nope.
Um, okay, so childhood. So I guess like how are your parents? I guess maybe some background on were they? You said you kind of lived a sheltered life in the city. Were your parents very big on education? Were they pushed you to do sports, or was it more like, okay, go play this sport and we'll see what happens?
No, I grew up in a household that was, um, I think, laissez-faire is probably the best description of how I was raised. I was never pushed to do anything. I was never told to do anything. I was reasoned with, um, and it was mostly the statement would be, if I were you, I wouldn't do this.
Mm.
It was not, don't do this, or you're not allowed to do this, or as long as your feet are under my table, my rules. There was none of that. It was very much a laissez-faire. And what it did for me, and I can only say this in hindsight, of course, is that I feel I grew up very much wanting to reason myself. Right? Don't I don't look at the world in black and white. I look at it in all shades of gray, and there are reasons for everything. For the good things and for the bad things. And I like to think in those terms.
So allowed you to really like analyze the situation, think it through, good or bad, to for yourself, so that and that's a tool that your parents gave you or taught you growing up.
Correct.
That's very powerful. Yeah.
Right.
Because sometimes parents say, don't do that or else this is going to happen, but they never give context as to why they're telling you not to do this.
The why is something that is still to this day very important to me.
Yeah.
'Cause there is a why for everything. However horrible things are, or however positive they are, there's always a why. And the why is, for me at least, in my mind, is scientific. Right? It's not voodoo. I'm not a religious person. There's always a reason for something, and the reason has a scientific, a historic, a documentable, verifiable reason behind it.
And do you find comfort in that, knowing now that you're obviously you've lived and you've passed through a lot of situations? Do you find comfort knowing that what's going to happen is going to happen and there's a reason? And do you find that like you're like, oh, what is the reason? Do you search for the answer, the why when things happen? Like, are you conditioned?
For me, it helps me to understand things, right?
Mm.
If something happens, I can't sit here and say, well, it was meant to be. That just is not the way that in my mind, that's not the way things happen. That nothing is ever meant to be. There are reasons for everything. You just have to discover them and find out.
I agree. I have a similar, process where I believe that everything happens for a reason, and learn from it. And I'm a big believer on failure, of trying and failing, and not looking as failure as a bad thing, but more of as a teacher or a learning process. I've learned more from my failures than my successes. As cliche as that sounds,
It's
but
cliche, but success makes blind, right? It's like in sales, revenue cures everything, right? Companies that are outrageously successful in on the revenue side are often also the ones who are most wasteful with their resources because they have no need to conserve. They have no incentive to conserve. They just make more and more and more money. And the ones who struggle are the ones that are better in their operational processes. They do things cheaper because they're more conscious of their limited resources.
and explain to me, like, so now you're 16, right? In school, were you a good student? Were you an average student? Did you excel? Like, what was?
Interesting question. I did not excel at all until my year abroad. Um, I I was a mediocre student. I was lazy. I did not enjoy to learn. And then I went abroad for a year, and that changed my whole mindset. And I came back and continued my education. And I was, for me, at that point, it wasn't about grades anymore. It was about learning. I wanted to learn. I wanted to know more things. And that was my motivation henceforth.
You said two interesting things. You said you were lazy, and then you were motivated after. Do you believe that you felt challenged before you went abroad? Do you feel like your interest was peaked, and that's therefore you weren't as motivated to learn?
I don't want to, some, I said earlier, there's a reason for everything, right? So I feel that going abroad, taking on this challenge of being away from your home, from the place and the parents and the siblings and the friends you've been with for 16 years, for a year, at a time where there was no internet. Long distance phone calls were outrageously expensive. So there was no contact back to where I came from. I think that really was an eye opener for me. It taught me a lot about myself. It taught me what was important to me in life, and I really began to focus on learning for the sake of learning, not for the sake of getting good grades. They did come along as a result, but it wasn't the motivation.
Right. And it sounds like the trip abroad really, you matured, obviously, 16 to 17 years old. You saw a lot of different things. How did you deal with and how did you deal with like probably moments of like, oh, I kind of miss home. Or, was this a good idea coming here? Should I go back? Did you ever have those thoughts? Like,
Um, No, not to the point where I felt homesick or I felt, I wanted to pack up and leave. Um, Obviously, you go through phases throughout the year, and there were definitely moments where things were extra challenging, but I never thought that I would give up or leave. I had a wonderful host family that I lived with, and I'm still very, very close to my host mother, my host sister, and my two brothers, um, to the point that I call them my American family, and they are to me like family. And we've seen each other many, many, many times since. We've spent time together here in Europe. In fact, one of my host brothers now lives in Europe, so I talked to him about this fact that we traded continents as a result of the experience, and so it's still a very important part of my life.
Fantastic. So tell me, you go back to Germany, and from there, obviously, you go on to college. What was going on through your head? What was your 17-year-old mindset of like, where am I going in my life? What are you going to do in college? What's going to be your future life looking like?
So when I got back from the exchange, I had 2 more years left of high school in Germany, and I did those, and that those years really, um, I was consumed with learning during those 2 years. That was what was important to me. And then I decided not to go to college. Germany has a slightly different educational system. Only a lower percentage of all graduates actually go to college after graduating. Most people do an apprenticeship program, and I did one for 3 years with a company that considered this 3 year program equivalent to a bachelor's degree. Um, and the benefits, sort of in hindsight, were that not only did I get education, but I also worked in a company. And
Yeah.
after 3 years, I was ready to take on responsibility without any further training within the company.
Yeah, I feel like maybe we should be. I think that's very important, and I think that right now, a lot of kids are going to college, spending 4 to 8 years in college, then coming out no experience, and then they're trying to get into the workforce at 24, 26, or 24 years old. I mean, a lot of the companies, and then the companies have to train them to learn. And I'm not talking about accountants or lawyers specific where you go to college. I'm talking about people that go and get regular diplomas, and then the company has to train them. I'm not saying college is in perm, but I'm just saying, how do we get these students in today's world ready to enter the workforce where they have a path to success, right?
Yeah, I think Germany has, in some of the other European countries have this system set up where companies um, educate through apprenticeship programs for a variety of roles, blue collar and white collar roles, and the the education is always a mix. So you spend half of the time going to school and learning, or going to a university type school to learn, and the other half you spend working, and they rotate you through all the different functions within a company so that you are ready at the end to step in a role and be productive right away. You could argue that you learn less of a scientific way of learning or a scientific way of operating if you assume that all colleges and universities truly teach scientific ways to operate, right? And the I think it's a little bit of a stretch these days, and certainly if you're in if you're in if you're in a scientific field, um, then that's part of the education. If your plan is to go into research afterwards, that's part of your education. But if you plan on, getting a BA in economics and then going on into a company to be part of sales or marketing or accounting, then, I doubt that colleges actually teach that way.
Yeah, and I think that I tell every student that talks to me about being an entrepreneur, I tell them they should go get a sales job,
Mm.
that they should learn how to sell. Not just because they have to sell, but because it teaches you communication, it teaches you how to understand the product and to be able to connect that product with the person's needs.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of students that are going to college to get certain degrees and then coming out and doing completely different things. And I get it. 4 years of college, very important. You grow, you mature, and then a company takes you on as a young employee. It's fantastic. They get, energy and stuff. But I think that young students going into college should think more about, hey, is this the right path for me? How can I gain the most experience in the field that I want to go in? And I think internship is one of the best ways. You can try out a company for a summer, see if you like it, and if you don't, you don't have to. Maybe I'll save you 3 years of college going in the wrong direction. You know.
Yes.
Okay, so then you did the apprenticeship, and then what happened from there? You're still in Germany.
I'm still in Germany. I stayed with the company that I did the apprenticeship program with for a total of 15 years.
15 years.
It's a chemical, it's Bayer, the now known as a pharmaceutical company, the aspirin people.
Yeah.
Back in the day, they also they were actually bigger on the chemical side. They were a large chemical company. So I spent my time there with inorganic pigments and with isocyanate resins. Um, and initially started in sales and then moved into supply chain, and built and ran a couple of supply chain organizations within Bayer. And then in 2000 or around 2000, the uh, the internet came around, and it came around late for chemical companies because they're not known for organizational innovation. It's a slow moving environment, and so in 2000, this idea of doing business through the internet came about. And we labeled it, or we called it e-business, and others called it that as well. And my boss, looked around his team and thought that, where would he put this new thing? And then he said to himself, well, it has to have something to do with supply chain or logistics. So we'll just give it to Henning and I'll take care of it.
Interesting.
And within a year, this thing exploded. Initially I was thought to be maybe 10% of my time. After a year, it was 90% of my time. I had two full-time people working for me on this subject, and I traveled the world because we were looking at all these different e-business solutions that
What was
popped up. And
explain what is the business? What was it like? What were you building, or what were you acquiring?
we were looking at all the platforms that existed, from these first CRM systems to trading platforms for chemicals, for marketplaces, search engines, anything that had to do with chemicals. We wanted to know about it. We wanted a stake in this because, it was the heydays, and everybody knew that the majority of these platforms would die,
Right.
but you didn't know which 90% would die. So you wanted to be in as many as you could in order to be with the winner at the end.
So diversify, which is kind of, if you think about AI right now, we're in a similar situation, right?
Yes. these things repeat themselves, and now it is AI, and you want to try and work with everything, because you don't want to miss out on the one or two things that make it to the end.
And then from there, so you're working in this, building up this e-business after a year. Where did you go from there? What, were you still at that company or did you end up?
Well, in the course of those activities, I met a founder of a e-business out of Kansas City, Missouri, and he came back to me and said, "Can you picture yourself building my business in Europe?" And it was a search engine for chemicals that provided lead information to chemical companies about um, formulators, chemists that show an interest in their products. And I looked at it and I said, "Yep, I can picture myself doing that." Flew to Kansas City, negotiated a contract in a Starbucks, and came back home and told my family that I was leaving a company with 160,000 employees to go to work for as number seven for a startup. And
How old were you at this point?
pardon me,
How old were you?
um, mid 30s. Yeah, 34, 35.
Were you had your own family, or you're talking about your mom and your dad family?
No, I had my own family.
Oh yeah.
I had three kids at the time, um, and no, I had my own family.
And you took them with you, or they stayed in Germany and you went?
No, the role was to build it in Europe,
Oh, I
so
see.
I stayed in Germany. That was the whole point, that
Okay.
he had tried to, travel over to Europe and sell, and found out that in order to be taken seriously by those conservative European companies, you have to be European, you have to be based and live here. And so he decided that he wanted me to build this business, and it started with setting up a legal entity, and then starting to visit those chemical companies throughout Europe. But it
And
was
this
a interesting. It was a really interesting experience for me. It was probably the hardest job I ever had in my life. The first 2 or 3 years were brutal. A ton of travel, very little success, a lot of financial tightness, um, but eventually we pulled through and became successful. And at the end, when we sold the business, Europe contributed 40 some percent of the revenue to the company, and we had built I had built a business in Europe with, at that point, then 10 or 11 people spread out throughout Europe. So it was a wonderful experience, and I appreciate the fact that the founder stuck with me through the time that it took. And I, in hindsight, um, do think that some of it was my inexperience, because it was my first startup, my first venture outside the corporate world. But the other part is truly the fact that European companies are not quick in embracing new things and innovation. And especially in the chemical industry, where when you build a chemical plant, you build it for 30 or 40 years. You don't expect a return in the first 5 or 10 years. It's a major investment. And so the thinking is in these long cycles. And when somebody comes along and offers you something new, you don't just jump on it because it's new. You don't want to be the first or the second to use it. The first client, it took 18 months to win the first client in Europe. And they were ferociously loyal and stayed with us until the end.
this founder must have been very persuasive when you met him, because it's a big risk. You're leaving an established job you going 2 years, and I know that he stuck through you, but you also 2 years was tough because did this founder give you space to operate, to learn? Like that's what you're saying, right? So like
Yeah.
it's not like a corporate where there's quarterly reports and they're analyzing you and they're what's going on, what's this. It's how do we keep moving forward? How can we, there was momentum behind you, do you feel?
Yes, he was supportive in any which way he could, and stuck with me throughout the process. And I compare this or put this into context with what I'm doing today, because today, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, well, I place sales leaders into jobs and I look for people who have done the 0 to 1 million journey and the 1 million to 5 million journey and the 5 million to $20 million journey. And each one requires a specific skill set, right? And there are great arguments why, if you're a founder, you should bring the specialist in to do 0 to 1, the specialist then for 1 to 5, the next specialist from 5 to 20. Um, and he didn't do that. He stuck with me, and as a matter of fact, I eventually led not just Europe but global sales and marketing. So he trusted me enough to give me all of that responsibility.
It's fantastic. And then from there, so how long were you with that company for?
That was 11 years until we were acquired. So we sold the business to a U.S. company, and then I spent another 6 years with the acquiring company.
Okay. Okay. And then from there, where did you go from there?
At that point, I decided I was going to. I was the acquiring company was again a large corporation, and after 6 years, it was enough, and I said I don't want to go back into that world, and I started Vendux, my current startup, in the U.S. as a matching placement agency for fractional sales leaders.
I'm very interested in going into the startup. I had one question for you. What's your thoughts about the younger generation that switch jobs more frequently? Because it sounds like you in your first job 15 years, second job 11 years, then it gets acquired, then you're still there 6 years later.
Yeah.
So technically you work for two companies. There was two parts of the second company, and then you get acquired, and then we'll decide to go on your own. But why? Why did you stay with these companies? What was your expectation? Because I see a lot of the youth working at one job for 2 years, then switch to another job, and they're just constantly changing jobs. Is that a cultural thing in America? Is that just how you get more money when you switch jobs?
I don't have the same observation. I do think the change has been that there was a time where you would join a company and you would spend your entire career in one company, the lifetimers, and that doesn't happen anymore. That is truly a thing of the past. But I look at executive resumes all day, every day, and I see those careers, and I see people in their 50s and in their 60s, that that have have different career paths. There are those that mirror my career path, 3, 4 long stints with companies, and there are those who do 1 or 2 years in a company and then switch, and then the next one, and then the next one. Um, and um, if I wanted to establish a pattern, then it's probably a pattern where it's based on the industry that they're in. Where if you're in tech or in SaaS, you end up having these shorter stints. And if you're in more traditional companies, you stay longer. And it has to do with the nature of those companies. I mean, a lot of the startups either fold or they get acquired. or they get an institutional investor that takes over, and that always leads to change.
Yeah.
And a lot of these changes have to do with that in tech and SaaS. Another factor is money. Um, and I say this particularly because I look at sales roles and people who have sales and sales leadership careers. And when I ask the question, why did you get into sales? I often hear money. When I hear, why did you go from this company to the next? Why did you go from this role to this role? Often it is money, right? I was headhunted out. They offered me $50,000 more. Of course I changed. So I think both of these career patterns exist. I don't think that it's necessarily young people today that do the job hopping. Um, I think it's more tied to the industry.
I think was a third one that, as you were discussing, I didn't realize that now there is more access to more job openings. Whereas you worked for a company, you didn't know about all the job openings 20, 30 years ago because they weren't available publicly like this. Whereas now there's job markets, there's individuals like yourself that are in the industry that are moving people around in the sense.
Yeah, another factor is the remote work, which allows people to stay put in one place, and then you can change jobs, which also makes it more convenient. You don't have to consider moving. You don't have to consider, uplifting or uprooting your family and moving them to a new place. I think that's another big contributing factor in why it's easier today than maybe, and I don't wouldn't say 20 years ago, but 30 or 40 years ago, to do rapid job changes.
It's who you back then. It's who you knew in certain companies that would get your application on certain table, a desk, and maybe they would hire you or not. So tell
Yeah,
me, why
go
that
ahead.
doesn't work like that?
No, that's a whole nother topic about the value of networking, because for somebody to drop your resume on somebody's table, you have to be connected to that person.
Sure.
And um, and yes, 30, 40 years ago, it was harder to network. But, with 20 years ago, internet, LinkedIn, other places, it gets easier and easier to network. And I meet executives in their 50s and 60s today who have tremendous networks and have benefited throughout their career from those networks.
If you had to give like three tools in networking, what would you say? Is that something that you won't even want to discuss? It's up to you, but I figure you brought it up. But like, what would be three things
Yeah.
that you would say, focus on these three things? This is how you build your network.
Yeah. So one place for me is LinkedIn. Um, it has a little bit of a reputation now because it's been around for so long and there is a lot of activity there. But I can tell you, when you got in touch with me, the first place I looked at who you are was LinkedIn. I looked at your profile. And when I can't find somebody's profile, I'll send them a message and I say, hey, can you send me your link? And if you don't have a profile, which to this day, I've not met a single executive that doesn't have a LinkedIn profile. But if you don't have one, you don't really exist as a professional, not in this country. Um, and the profile tells me a lot about you. Not only the things that you write, but I can see how old it is, how many connections you have, how much overlap we have in our connections. And that's all part of networking. So LinkedIn to me is a really important tool. And for many years, I ignored it. I turned down connection requests. I only connected with people that I had physical interactions with, and those were mostly people that I worked with. So when I started my business, that network was totally useless because it did not include founders, owners, CEOs, investors, sort of people that operate in the fractional executive space. And I had to build that network and started doing that 6 years ago. And I admire executives and tell my kids and everyone who's willing to listen, start networking early, build that network as soon as you can, and think about the value, the future value of the network. So don't just connect with your BFFs, connect with professionally people that are in decision making positions. um,
Can you give
so
us the layers of the connection? Like, so is it me just reaching out to someone on LinkedIn saying hello and having a conversation? Is it following up with them? Is it, how do you build a long, like a residual relationship that can grow?
I still believe that content, so posting valuable content, sharing valuable content is the key. There is certainly a trend now that personal posts carry a lot of weight and get a lot of attention. Um, but I still think that content posts have a longer shelf life because they stick around on LinkedIn, and they allow you to convey your professional knowledge to the audience that you're building. So if you're a middle manager in a certain industry vertical and you are connected to CEOs and presidents and VPs in the same industry, you posting content, you sharing your industry know-how, um, demonstrates to those decision makers that you that 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 you can bring value and that knowledge into their organization.
Gotcha. But how do you, when you're connecting with one specific individual, like for example, when you started building your business 6 years ago, I mean, when you started networking 6 years ago, what was your strategy?
um, Pretty simple, actually. I reached out as a founder to other founders, and my only goal
Oh,
was
look at that. That's what I'm doing.
the only goal is was that we would become first degree connections so that they accepted my invite, and then they would be able to see my content, because then my content would show up in their feed.
I see.
Then I try to have them follow my business page or my business on LinkedIn so that again they would see the content. That was my LinkedIn strategy at the beginning. I mean, at some point, I also was more direct in the outreach. I looked for triggers where somebody might be ready to get a fractional executive into their organization. But still, to this day, a lot of my outreach is geared towards simply building connections to founders, owners, and CEOs of SMBs.
Could you explain? I'd love to hear more about your company. So you left. You were at the company that got acquired 6 years. I'm sure you got to a point where like, okay, what am I doing? Started having some thoughts. Explain that transition from leaving a company with a steady job to starting a brand new company from scratch.
Well, I left the company first and
Okay.
then thought about what it is that I wanted to do. And it became pretty clear to me right away that I didn't want to go back into into a what and at that point was a boring treadmill. I didn't feel that I was learning anything new. And I had built this when this founder from Kansas City reached out to me and I helped him build the business or build it for him in Europe. I always thought of myself as a founder, and he treated me as a founder and as an equal. And so I was ready to do that again. I wanted to build something. I wanted to be in a small organization, and sit at the top of the of the food chain again, and not somewhere in the middle. And so, then I I toyed with the idea of becoming a fractional executive, because I liked the idea of going into an organization that needed something built, that needed something fixed, that needed my specific skill set for a limited amount of time. And that's when I discovered that at that point, 700 connections on LinkedIn just weren't good enough to find those roles easily. And when I looked for a matchmaker or an agency, I couldn't find one. The ones that existed at the time covered the entire C-suite. And to me, that meant they focused on CEOs, COOs, and maybe CFOs, but not on a VP of sales or a chief revenue officer. And so I didn't feel represented. And then it was almost like a eureka moment, because I had always thought of I had always wanted to start a business that was my own idea, but I never felt I had an idea that was good enough to justify going out on my own. I had taken somebody else's idea and turned it into a business that was at the end big enough to be acquired. Um, and so the eureka moment was, hey, this is now my business idea. We're missing we're missing a matchmaker here. I also, the business that I built in Europe was a chemical search engine that matched chemists to the right materials. And now I'm matching executives into the right jobs. So there was this connection, this transfer or this alignment of
Correlation.
co- yes, the correlation. And I thought, this is it. And then I started writing a business plan for it, and in no time that was going to be the thing for me. That I was going to build Vendox to be that missing matchmaker, that missing agency. That in the simple product market fit assumption was, what I am missing, others must be missing too.
It's interesting when you talk about your business, like your energy level goes up, when you're discussing like the transitioning of the business plan stuff, your energy goes up. So it's like, okay, this is where you're supposed to be doing. So tell us about the company, the name, and what your mission with the company and how you operate.
Yeah. So Vendox is a play on two Latin words. Venditio is Latin for sales, and dux is Latin for leadership. So I basically the roles that I staff are represented in the name of the company. Um, we have on one side of our matchmaking a pre-vetted roster of executives. At this point, about 1,100. They're all full-time fractional executives, meaning they are in 2 to 5 different roles in parallel, taking on leadership roles in sales, business development, growth, and we match them with their skill set against the opportunities that we develop with clients when they come to us. And clients, to this day, the fractional sales leadership model isn't a sort of a go-to solution. Um, when companies go out and hire full-time, they either do it because they have an empty seat on an org chart that they want to fill, um, or they want to replace somebody that is there and needs to be swapped out. The fractional opportunities come about because companies experience problems or challenges, and now they look for a solution to that challenge. And in their initial inclination, they may say, well, let's get a consultant in, or we have Joe here internally, and Joe's going to fix the problem for us. Or, yeah, I think the problem's going to go away. It's not that big a deal. Those are sort of the go-to um, uh, solutions that companies embrace when they encounter a problem. The fractional executive is a solution that we can help scope. And so when we engage with a founder that comes to us with a sales problem, we scope an assignment around it and say, from where you are in sales and where you want to go, these are the things that need to happen in between. These are the criteria, the skills, the past experiences that a fractional sales leader needs to bring to the table. And those that's the list that we match against. And now we try to find somebody on our roster that has all these past experiences, that has worked a very similar product in a very similar market before, that has solved this very problem before that the client is experiencing. And that's the executive that we then introduce to the client. They interview, they make the final decision, and then we put the contracts in place.
And when you're organizing the contracts or these are fractional executives that are working in different companies. So
Yes,
like so it's like whatever, 40 hours a week, they're working 10 hours here, 10 hours there, like that.
that is correct. They do, and typically between 2 and 5 different assignments in parallel.
Perfect. Wow. And the executives that left these corporate jobs enjoy the diversity of the work? Do you find that they enjoy it?
It's one of the motivators that brought them into this space, right? They spent their career. Typically, what you do is you spend your career, if it's not the same company, you tend to spend it in the same vertical or maybe two verticals over 30 years. And then you expand your portfolio because all of a sudden someone from a very different industry comes to you and sees something in your value and brings you in as a fractional executive. And that diversity is very interesting when you spend the initial part of your career in one or two verticals.
And it's interesting. I really think it's fascinating. And are most of the clients small or mid-sized businesses?
Um, our clients are anywhere from 0 to $100 million.
Okay.
So they
So
are more on
it's
the
a variety.
smaller. They're small on the smaller and mid-sized kinds, or SMBs. The the thinking or the thought you have to consider is the question of, can you solve this problem with a part-time, with a fractional resource?
Mm.
And if you think Fortune 5,000, half a billion, billion, $10 billion company, there are no problems that a fractional resource can solve. First of all, because the problems are so big, they always require multiple people. I mean, large corporations put teams on problems, not individuals. The other thing with these large corporations is that they they have a very strong internal focus. I always said that when I was in a large corporation, 80% of what I was paid because I knew how to get things done on the inside, how to move the needle on the inside, and only 20% for the outside. And in small companies, it's exactly the opposite. The, the functions are very much outwardly focused, and at the end, client focused. And so, in these large corporations, a fractional executive coming in for a few months on a part-time role can't possibly have all that inside knowledge. Now, I like to think of this as a window of opportunity for fractionals, and it's certainly for all fractionals. It's more on the SMB side, and then there are differences between different fractional roles. Um, if you're in sales, a sales team of 7 or 8 account executives in most cases requires a full-time sales leader. So at 10 million, at 15 million in revenue, most companies can't really do with a fractional sales leader anymore. It has to be at that point, a full-time role. A fractional CMO can stay longer. A fractional CFO can stay even longer. I would argue that companies that are at 20, 30 million in revenue can still do with a fractional CFO. They don't need a full-time CFO, in their in their on their leadership team. So that window of opportunities is a little different per bifunctional roles. And on the sales side, the initial window is somewhere from 0 to 15, from 0 to 20 million. But then there are sort of a secondary window when companies go through some form of restructuring, or they're expanding into new geographies, into new markets with new products, and they need expertise that they don't have in-house. And then a fractional executive is a perfect way to bring in that expertise. And that's how we have some of our clients be in the 50 to $100 million range.
Kind of how like the original founder brought you in for the European section, right? You were an expert in that area, and then you were able to work together and grow it.
Yes,
And
correct.
and if it's like a younger, a newer company, I'm sure there's compensation, but is it also, do they get equity during that time, or is that not really on the table, or is it depends on the situation? I'm always curious on the deal side, you know?
Yeah. The Sometimes equity makes sense, and sometimes either the founder or the executive or both want to give and get equity. Um, I mean, there have to be a number of thoughts here. One is that the executive is contracted for a specific amount of time, or at
Makes
least
it
a
harder.
foreseeable amount of time if it's not
Yeah.
fixed. So the founder has to think about, does he want a person that's there maybe for 6 months on the cap table for the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah.
Um, the executive needs to think about, for that engagement, do I, you know, do I really want to do all the due diligence that's required for me to feel comfortable with accepting equity as a form of payment?
Yeah.
Um,
That's where I'm interested. I'm interested in, like, well, first, a lot of them have was it vesting periods, right? 2, 3,
yes,
4 years. If they're
correct.
only coming in for 3 to 6 months, it might not make sense to have the equity.
They have no way of, they generally speaking have no way of influencing it over a 3 to 5 year period. Um, so it's um, so in some deals, in some cases, it's part of the deal. In the majority of the cases, it is not. Another reason why equity is not a factor in the majority of cases is because we're not only dealing um, with startup and scale up businesses, we're also dealing with family owned businesses, privately held businesses where equity is just not ever an option. They don't have the same kind of equity programs that a startup has. So I think it's really the exception, not the rule.
Is there this is all great. I'm having a really good time here listening to the details of the industry. Just you have individuals that have decades of experience, and here you are, opening up new opportunities for them and also benefiting. It's like a double win. The companies are winning, and the executives are also winning. Could you tell me what was your experience starting your business? Like, is there any obstacles that you ran into running your business that you've learned from that you think would be valuable?
Well, don't start it right before COVID would be one obstacle
Yeah,
that I
that's
ran
true.
into. So we launched late 2019, and 2020 was a dead year. I keep saying the best thing about it is that we survived. Um, but there was, I mean, everyone was looking to get rid of people. Nobody was looking to add people to their staff. So that was 2020 for us. Um, I think the challenges are they are very similar to every other startup. Me as the founder doing way too many things myself and thinking only I can do them. I make the same mistakes that every other founder does. Um, then the area that we're in is very specific, right? If there is that one window of opportunity to place a fractional executive in the lifetime of a company, every client is a client only once, and there's no repeat business. There is no existing business. We have to continuously generate new opportunities for the executives. That is certainly a challenge. Um, Other than that, we're doing well. We acquired another business about a month ago, a company called Shiny. They're a platform that matches fractional executives with opportunities, and it has two distinct differences to the Vendox business. One is it's a fully automated platform. There's no manual touch involved. And the other is that they cover all the different functional areas with a focus on CMOs, COOs, and CTOs
Mm.
and CFOs, those four. And what that does for us is we can now place executives into other functional areas without diluting the Vendox brand. Because the goal is to run both platforms, both businesses under their respective brands. The idea is not to merge them together. They both have existing brand value, and we can keep Vendox focused on sales.
It's fantastic. And you can also, I'm sure there's a lot of synergy because it's the same industry, same type of things. So you're learning how to improve, the software on this side, but also make new connections on the software end side and all that. So that's interesting.
Yes.
Um, did you ever think as a kid you'd become an entrepreneur?
No, when I was a kid, I wanted to become a captain on a large freight vessel or an oil tanker. That was what I wanted to become when I grew up.
If you can go back to your 20-year-old self, coming out of college or your apprenticeship, what would be the few, advice, points of advice that you would give yourself?
That's a great question. We talked about these different types of careers, and while I'm not an advocate for job hopping, I do think that I would advise myself to be a little bit more adventurous and to change jobs and companies a little bit more frequently. Um, I, 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 was always looking. I never put a view on the outside world. I always looked within the business that I was in, and what would be my next opportunity.
Mm.
Sort of within Bayer, that was that there were plenty of opportunities in such a large corporation. With the startup out of Kansas City, I grew with the company and my responsibility grew with the company. Then in the acquired company, there were opportunities because they were continually buying other companies and they all needed to be integrated and merged. And so I merged, I don't know how many sales teams over the 6 years that I was there. Um, but I always looked for opportunities within the company itself, and therefore, you know, it, it I would advise myself to be a little bit more adventurous when it comes to changes, because I think it's healthy for a career, for one's personal development, um, and provides more interesting perspectives, on variations in jobs and companies.
Also, networking, you meet different people, you make different connections that can lead to other opportunities.
It leads
Uh,
into the networking aspect or the lack thereof that I experienced for the vast majority of my career. Yes.
so tell me, a portion of your career, you were in sales.
Yep.
What was your strategy in sales? Why were you so good at it?
I'm not sure I was good at it. um,
What's your methodology of sales? Like, do you have one?
um, I certainly don't have one that I put a label on. Right. I'm not sitting here and saying I follow this methodology, and Banff or Sandler or Band is the right one. That's not what I'm doing. I um, I also believe that I had to learn how to be good in sales and how to understand the psychology of a sale. Because my very first sales role was actually not as an individual contributor. I was put into a sales management role where I had to lead, I think it was 5 or 6 salespeople and 10 distributors. And so I never was a back carrier, um, or I wasn't a back carrier before I became a sales leader. And then I had to learn when I started when I built the business in Europe for the startup out of Kansas City. I had to learn how to do this and how to do this right. And I do believe um, that I think this you have to bring across a combination of passion and trust, and trust, reliability, um, especially in the European sales theater that I was in at the time. Um, you can't come across as flaky. You can't come across as overly hyped. You need to be passionate about what you're selling, especially when it's a brand new solution that the market hasn't seen before.
Mm.
Um, but it has to be combined with trust. Just because it's new, no one's going to buy it. Just because it's cheap, no one's going to buy it. Just because it's free, nobody's going to use it. It has to come with trust. And I believe I pride myself in believing that I'm good at winning somebody's trust, when I have a chance to meet with them.
Fantastic. Is there any books or um, tools or messages you would like to leave younger, new entrepreneurs that are entering the sphere?
Um, I'm going to use the opportunity and announce that I'm in the process of writing a book, and
Very
it
net.
will
Awesome.
come out in 3, maybe 4 months max. It should be ready. Working title is The Perfect Match, but we're going to have a different title for it. But it's going to tell the story of fractional executives, not only from the viewpoint of the executive, why it's such a great solution, and such a great career choice, not only from the viewpoint of the company, why is it a great solution to a lot of problems, but really how do you make this work? What does the executive need to do? What does the company need to do? And how does that need to come together? That's what we're going to focus the book on, and I look forward to seeing myself and being able to label myself an author on LinkedIn.
Awesome, awesome. And is there any other books or that you would suggest to entrepreneurs?
Um, I personally um, read I read very few business books. Most of the books that I read um, are um, nonfiction history books,
Mm.
mm, because I have continued um, this search of learning, and this passion for learning. So, when I, as an example, when I moved from Germany to Kansas City eventually, I wanted to know everything about the area, and I bought every possible book that, talked about the Western migration, the Santa Fe Trail, how Missouri was settled. Then I moved here to California, where I live now, and I'm reading every book on how the Spanish settled California first,
Yeah.
and how the mission system was built, and how the wine industry came about. All of these things are of interest to me. So my reading follows my personal passion. I don't really have good advice on business books.
Oh, it's great. And what's interesting, I'm a big book person. My thing is what my interest is. If somebody tells me, hey, this specific system or this type of book and it interests me, I'll read it. It's not just business, it's variety. I haven't gotten into fiction as much as I would like to, because I think sometimes it's okay to read a fictional book and just unplug and just enjoy, and not have to try to absorb all the information like a business book. So I'm working on that. All right, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed listening to your story. I think it's super fascinating. It's been pretty awesome experience for me.
Thank you, Jimmy. I appreciate the invite. Look forward to eventually hearing all the other stories that you're compiling. So thank you for doing what you're doing.